Good morning, I'm David Speers. Welcome to AM Agenda. Barack Obama has notched up 100 days in the White House, but is his presidency living up to the hope and optimism of his candidacy? We'll be talking to the Lowy Institute's Michael Fullilove about that shortly, and whether the additional 450 Australian troops being sent to Afghanistan are merely being sent to appease the Obama White House. Later in the show, our panel of senators, Doug Cameron and Eric Abetz, will be looking at the latest boat arrivals in Australia, and also what we can expect to come out of today's meeting of state and federal leaders in Tasmania. First, we're starting to get a clearer idea of where the coalition stands on the whole issue of climate change and emissions trading. It's released an independent report it commissioned from the Centre for International Economics on the government's carbon pollution reduction scheme. Perhaps not surprisingly, the report finds that the scheme the government has put forward will cost tens of thousands of jobs without reducing carbon emissions by that much. Joining me now for a look at this is the Shadow Minister for Emissions Trading, Andrew Robb. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, David.
What changes, after seeing this report, will you be demanding to the government scheme?
Well, the onus is in many respects on the government. Kevin Rudd said before the last election, on many occasions, he said he would bring in a scheme which would result in deep cuts to emissions and would not disadvantage our export and import competing industries. Now, if they come up with a scheme which does that, we would be supportive. But the thing is, the scheme they've got on the table at the moment fails on both counts. It would lead to tens of thousands of jobs lost, a lot of discouragement for investment, a lot of temptation to take business overseas, and it wouldn't do much about CO2 emissions. So they've got to come up with changes. What the report does confirm, that we had presented to us yesterday, is that they have not explored a lot of other options that are on the table.
Well, I want to look at those options. What are some of those options that aren't being looked at?
Well, there's a scheme called the hybrid scheme, which is McKibben. It's Warwick McKibben. He's a member of the Reserve Bank, many years of experience in all of these sorts of scheme developments. He's taken the best of a cap and trade type scheme and the best of a carbon tax, and he put them together. It's quite complicated to explain, but in practice...
This is the Canadian model?
No, that's right. Another one again.
Okay.
The Canadian model is a cap and trade, which preserves a lot of the balance sheets of companies so they can actually reinvest in innovative, low carbon technology. So there's two schemes.
Okay.
Then you've got a carbon tax by itself. All of those, David Pearce said, they've all got very strong merit. What should have happened, he said, is over the last 18 months, they should have, when they modelled their narrow scheme, they should have modelled all these others and empirically established what is the best. This is the thing about this is it's the biggest structural change, deliberate structural change in our economy, probably ever. All right, so to rush headlong into a scheme, not consider all these legitimate and significant alternatives, not consider what effect their scheme will have in the next 20 years on jobs. They looked at 50 years, but they didn't look at the next 20 years.
All right, but you're suggesting there are some simpler ways or some other ways of reducing emissions that aren't being looked at, and you're talking about capturing carbon in the soil, for example.
Yes.
Are you saying that you could have a stronger target than the government's 5 to 15% by 2020?
Well, what David's report has confirmed is that there is more than one tool in the climate change toolbox. He has confirmed that. He has said, sure, you need a price of carbon, and there are lots of ways of doing that. A lot more serious analysis needs to be done, and it can be done quickly, to establish what's the best way. The government should do that, for one. But secondly, he's saying there are all these complementary measures, right? Improve the energy efficiency in the commercial building sector, store a lot more carbon in soil in all sorts of ways, just with standard agricultural practice. No revolution here. Now, what he has shown is that you can have a mix. A scheme can involve a whole mix of approaches.
With a higher target?
With potentially a higher target. I mean, but more than that, it probably means you can start immediately and have some things happening immediately which start to get you towards a target. At the moment, I mean, the government's basically wasted 18 months and has come up with a dud.
Well, just on your plan, though, just to be clear on this, you're no longer saying an emissions trading scheme is necessarily the way to go.
No, we're saying you do need a price of carbon. I mean, we were out there with a scheme 12 months before the government.
But it may not be a cap and trade, it might be a carbon tax.
It could be, you know, one of any of 4 or 5 might be the best way, and that work can be done quickly, and this is not a question of pushing it off into the never-never.
Well, this sounds like it takes the coalition back to, as my understanding was your policy was in support of a cap and trade scheme. You're now saying not necessarily. Well,
what we're saying, for the government, if the government is to come up with the most robust scheme, they should have, at the very least, this is what the report's saying. This is what the report... We haven't established a position yet on any of this.
You are open to a carbon tax.
Look, this is why we've got David Pearce to have a look at this and said, give us advice. What he has said to us is that the government should have done these things. We need to consider what he has said to us. We're also looking at what the Senate inquiry, there's still a major one that we instigated with the Greens. That's not finished yet. A lot of new ground is being tilled there.
So your mind is very much open?
Our mind is very much open. Of course, we've been doing a lot of work on this, but when we have finished, when we've seen what's come out of the Senate, when we've finished looking at what David Pearce has advised, we will then say to the government, if they haven't made changes by then, this is what we think should happen, and that's when we get into the substantive debate in June.
Okay, because the government, this time frame is pressing, and the government basically wants to know what you're demanding, but we won't know that for a couple of months.
Well, the thing is, it shouldn't just... This is a ploy. This is a political ploy. The bottom line is now, for months and months, almost daily, captains of industry have come out and said, this project's in jeopardy. 10,000 jobs in jeopardy here, 5,000 here, 4,000 there. You know, we'll be overseas with this. We'll be uncompetitive. You know, you're putting a tax on us when none of the rest of the world is facing it. What are you doing? Now, they're not responding to industry. I mean, sure, we've got a responsibility to work through all this and recommend what should happen, but the onus is on the government to respond to the major and legitimate concerns that are being voiced daily by industry and have been for several months now.
Just finally, Andrew Robb, the state and territory leaders are meeting in Tasmania today. One of the things they're talking about is a new, tougher energy efficiency standard for new homes, a 6-star energy rating. Do you think that would be a good idea?
Well, I'd have to see the detail, but certainly there is a place for a whole suite of measures. I suppose this has been our point. Don't just focus on an ETS to do all the heavy lifting, right? So there could well be merit in it. I'd need to look at it, but certainly there's a lot of scope with homes, with the commercial building sector, to make substantial energy savings, which reduces CO2.
Andrew Robb, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, David.